This is Alexis Schroeder. I met Alexis a few months ago after she came and visited the beautiful Altenheim gardens. And while she was taking a tour around the site, she noticed the cell tower and the antennas. She happens to be active in an organization called California for Safe Technology, or Californians for Safe Technology. And they do provide advocacy and education to the public and other groups around safety and technology. She contacted Councilmember Giles' office for assistance when she was looking for information from the city about the application process for permits to install antennas on the site. With that, I would like to hand it over to Alexis, and she's going to share her presentation with you. And if you have comments or questions, please wait until the end and I will call on you then.
Thank you, Deborah. I'm going to be sharing my screen. Oops, how do I get rid of this? Hold on. Trying to get rid of that. Oops. I'm trying to get rid of the screen. Hold on. There we go. Okay. Can everybody see the screen, I hope?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. Appreciate the feedback. So in the December of 1886, the president of the German General Benevolent Society, Fritz Rosenbaum, appealed to his countrymen living in the greater San Francisco area to consider building a home where elderly people of German descent would spend their remaining years. Adolf Sutro, also a member of this group, proposed a site in San Francisco, but it wasn't considered because it was too foggy. Instead, they chose this Oakland site in the Glenview district due to better climate and a bucolic setting amongst an already thriving German community. In February 1893, construction started, and by September 1890, construction started, and by September 1894, there were already 12 residents living in this home called the Altenheim. Unfortunately, a fire in 1908 destroyed that building. But in 1909, a new cornerstone was laid and rebuilding began, providing over 170 apartments to low-income seniors. In 1993, after 84 years, one of many permits for cell antennas on a cell tower was submitted to the City of Oakland to be located on this property. Since then, over 10 permits have been issued for cell antennas on the cell tower and on the buildings. As a side note, the City of Oakland gave this property landmark status, and it was included on the National Register of Historic Places. Despite being a landmark location, this beautiful property is now blemished. I'm Alexis Schroeder, and I have German grandparents, as well as a married last name, which brings with it some German heritage. I've lived in Oakland for over 36 years and have operated my small business here for over 27 years. The Altenheim is less than 1.5 miles from my house. I became interested in the topic of cell antennas in residential neighborhoods when Verizon Wireless informed our neighborhood that they would be putting 16 cell antennas on utility poles outside our homes in our little patch of Oakland. One of those poles is proposed to be across the street from my home. Gathering neighbors together, we decided to work to keep cell antennas out of all Oakland residential neighborhoods. And eventually the Altenheim, with all its cell antennas on the cell tower and roof, caught my attention, and I began to look into these application and permits. Many of these planning and building permits raised concerns, and I sought the involvement and support of District 5 Council Member Gallo and his staff. My main concerns were focused on aesthetics, health, and fire safety. In order to broaden the reach of education about cell antenna safety, a small group of us around the Bay Area formed Californians for Safe Technology. We wanted to be a place where organizations and individuals across California could work together to find strategies for educating communities, local government, and schools on safer technology choices. This includes my presentation to you today, as this cell antenna technology impacts both younger and older community members. And just so you know, the information I'm presenting comes from public records and other internet sources. The Altenheim currently has 27 cell antennas on its inventory list.
Whoa.
4 different operators of these cell antennas have their emitting equipment on either the cell tower nestled between the 2 buildings, or on the roof near the solar panels, or on the side of the building. 3 more antennas are scheduled to go on the tower, taking the total number of operating antennas to 30. The following are photographs taken by the RF engineer who measured the emissions from these cell antennas on May 11th of this year. Even though many of them can't be seen from the street, they are receiving and emitting devices which operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They have ancillary power equipment which supports their operation, which also contributes to the toxic soup of electromagnetic emissions. Operators of these antennas are T-Mobile and Verizon Wireless. Operators of these cell antennas are Verizon Wireless and AT&T Mobility. And operators of these cell antennas are AT&T Mobility and Sprint. I'd like to briefly share with you the active cell antenna modification projects. In May 2020, Verizon Wireless, through their agent Crown Castle, applied for a permit to add 3 new cell antennas to the existing cell tower. The City of Oakland approved this application within 24 hours. Due to the public access to these submittals, I found errors in the city's condition of approval. It was lacking the condition of having radio frequency emission measurements taken at the time of operation, to be submitted in writing, and to be compliant to FCC exposure limits prior to final permit sign-off. Even though the building permit was already issued the week before, the approval letter was amended by the city. In November 2020, T-Mobile, through their agent Crown Castle, applied for a permit to replace 3 cell antennas on the existing cell tower. The City of Oakland approved this application, and in January 2021, a permit was issued by the building department. However, in February 2021, I asked District 5 to address the concerns regarding the theoretical radio frequency emission measurements given with each of these applications. Given the very high maximum permissible exposure percentages, District 5 brought in the building department inspectors to review these reports. Based on these reports and public concern, both of these issued permits were then put on hold on March 9th until baseline or pre-installation radio frequency emission measurements were taken to ensure that the cumulative operation of the cell antennas on the cell tower and roof combined did not exceed the FCC exposure limits. On April 23rd, to the dismay of many folks on and off the property, and since the RF emission report measurements had not been taken yet, we were surprised to see scaffolding being erected around the cell tower despite an on-hold status. Then on May 4th, the contractor started removing cell antennas from the cell tower. The city was notified, and the following day, the building department issued a stop work order to T-Mobile's contractors. Shame on T-Mobile for their egregious behavior. A week later, on May 11th, the RF measurements were taken, and on May 25th, the T-Mobile project was taken off stop work status and returned to an issued status after the physical measurements were found to be compliant to FCC guidelines. It is not clear to me if the removed antennas were put back prior to the baseline measurements. As you can see, it's been quite a chore to keep all the parties involved in these permits in compliance with the telecom ordinances and permit requirements. These radio frequency measurements were only taken at the ground and at the roof. The roof locations had measurements for occupational workers, not the general public. It appears that no measurements were taken from any of the upper story resident rooms that surround the tower. All the FCC does is set the exposure limits. They provide no oversight over the limits. The FCC does not routinely perform RF exposure investigations unless there is an expectation that the FCC exposure limits may be exceeded. Even though T-Mobile's baseline pre-installation measurements were found to be compliant, An independent industrial hygienist reviewed this report and expressed his concern over the constant exposure that upper story residents might encounter with the tower's cell antennas. There are enough completed medical studies to warrant concern and caution for human exposure to radio frequency radiation. As you can see, the United States radiation exposure limits are so much higher than countries such as India, China, and Russia. Again, the FCC exercises no meaningful regulatory oversight over the location or operation of wireless facilities. Unless the FCC receives a complaint, the FCC never tests emissions. The law has not kept up with technology. Wireless infrastructure such as the cell tower and the rooftop antennas, like here at the Altenheim, are being installed with great speed and density. Currently, the Environmental Health Trust has taken the FCC to the 9th District Court regarding the FCC's guidelines in this area. These guidelines were established in 1996 as part of the Telecommunications Act and have not been revised or updated over the last 25 years. And per a 2015 independent Harvard ethics report, an RF engineer found that among 3,000 rooftop antennas tested, 10 to 20% of them exceeded the allowable radiation limits. We should be concerned as a community about this exposure. The overhead view property map on the right was included in the Altenheim's radio frequency pre-installation report by T-Mobile. A collection of measurements at all the identified roof and ground locations were taken over a 10-second time period, but the residents are exposed 24/7. These numbers are possibly misleading for certain hotspot areas around the property, where exposure time to the general public is greater near the roof, but the measurements are only given for occupational workers. The general public has a stronger requirement for exposure limits than occupational workers, who are informed of their risk. The general public is often not aware of their exposure. This general public on the upper floors at the Altenheim is closer to the antennas on the tower than the general public at the ground. The yellow arrow that I added points to the cell tower. In particular, the red triangle, which I added to this slide, has measurements that an occupational worker who is working around the roof should be very aware of before working in that area. But what about the upper story residents who reside just below that rooftop measurement location? This location is to the west of the cell tower. The industrial hygienist I spoke to said that residents around the cell tower would have it worse than the rooftop worker due to the fact that they have more exposure time and proximity to the tower and all its cell antennas. Here are some of the symptoms of microwave sickness and electrosensitivity. There are effects on your brain, ears, eyes, skin, heart, and mood, to say the least. Do you experience headaches or brain fog, have trouble sleeping, or ringing in your ears? Cell antennas are on both private and public property in Oakland, in the state of California, in the United States, and around the world. Private property commonly has cell towers and rooftop antennas. We are seeing more cell antenna and cell tower installations on or near senior living residences, schools, and churches. Public properties such as utility poles and lamp poles usually have 1 to 3 antennas. Many of these utility poles are right outside your place of residence. Look for the cell antenna on the top or hanging off the side or near the top of a utility pole. The bottom boxes on the pole are often supporting power equipment. As a side note, the 5G cell antennas require a closer proximity to one another in order to function correctly for each telecom operator, usually 300 to 500 feet apart, the equivalent of about 20 car lengths. This is why we're seeing an increase in applications for cell antennas at the planning department for all over Oakland. For example, let's say you have an AT&T cell phone. Unfortunately, the Verizon cell antenna outside your bedroom window on the utility pole does not give you a better cell reception with your AT&T phone, but it does put you at greater risk for electrosensitivity symptoms due to more exposure. This is what is happening in my neighborhood. Over 2,000 scientific studies from as early as the 1970s primarily among communities of our firefighters and military, show that there are biological effects due to emissions from this type of emitting equipment. Studies completed in the 1970s were initiated after World War II personnel experienced health problems while exposed to radar equipment, which uses microwave frequencies. In the 1990s, firefighters experienced symptoms after cell antennas were installed near or on firehouses. Quote, "The proximity of the towers and people living next to the towers is of grave concern," said LA fire captain and union president of Firefighters Local 1014. He said, "It's a very complex issue how these radio issues affect people all the way up to 3 miles away. There are health and safety issues that need to be discussed openly with the public," unquote. And today, the military uses an electronic megastorm of emitting devices called an electronic warfare tactical vehicle. So does Thor, a tactical humanitarian operations response vehicle by Verizon. I told you about the complete destruction of the original Altenheim building in 1908. Now we have more structures on the property to worry about. I outreached to the Oakland Fire Department for clarification and understanding of procedures they would follow if there was a fire on the cell tower versus at the building at the Altenheim. I have been told that the fire department does not have any concerns about their ability to fight such a fire at the Altenheim, as they have a pre-plan in place. But I have not been able to confirm if there have been any current inspections performed with the fire prevention department, given the special circumstances of multiple antenna modifications and seniors. My calls downtown and my public record requests have not been answered. But we know that electric fires are not put out with water. We know that building structures are. This poses a dilemma when 2 residential buildings closely surround most of the cell tower structure. Based on the photos that I shared with the fire department's chief of staff that you saw earlier with each of the 27 cell antennas, the fire marshal is now concerned about the closeness of the cell tower to the buildings as it pertains to possible violations of building codes. And they have also brought this to the attention of the hazardous materials specialists in the city about this tower, as well as the solar panels that line the rooftop. Again, I am waiting feedback from the fire marshal about his inquiries into code violations, so I don't have all the answers for you tonight. The public has limited impact right now on telecommunications infrastructure. All we can do is demand that the city follow its telecommunications regulation ordinances and make it publicly known when violations are discovered or uncovered. With cell antennas in residential neighborhoods, the community at the local level needs to be informed about the real benefits and the associated costs with the addition of cell antennas in these type of neighborhoods. We need to ask if telecom is solving a coverage gap or if they are satisfying a capacity gap. If they're solving a coverage gap, then how do they measure the gap in a way that makes sense to the public? Where specifically are the calls dropped? I believe that the city should already know its dead zones and be asking telecom to solve this issue, rather than telecom coming to the city to saturate every tower, pole, and rooftop with wireless infrastructure. From what their advertisements claim, telecom has coverage in your neighborhood. But when you go to the city with their permit request, all of a sudden they have a significant coverage gap. Either their ads are wrong or the telecom applicant. Why does a neighborhood need to suffer the proliferation of antennas near their homes? I'm confused on the message. Either they have coverage or they don't. So write to both the Altenheim and Eden Housing, as well as other private property cell antenna owners about your concerns. Share this presentation information with others. Ask for RF emission testing to ensure compliance and safety. Learn more about this issue and how it impacts all neighborhoods around Oakland and beyond. There are lots of great websites that explain the issue and the impacts. The FCC needs to revisit the RF emission exposure limits to be more in line with other countries who have found that the daily effects of RF emissions have serious health impacts. Write to them. What else should you do? Request public records that ask for RF emission testing reports that were submitted prior to final permit sign-off for any cell antenna project. public or private. Make your voice heard at city council meetings, especially with your district council member. Pass on this information about these cell antennas at the Altenheim, as well as others all over Oakland in your community newsletters and forum. Gain more knowledge about infrastructure and technology and how they work together, given their impacts of health, fire, and aesthetics on the general public. Every voice needs to be heard. You have the capacity to keep your neighborhood safe, healthy, and beautiful. Don't be silent, because that is what telecom is hoping the public will do, so they can put their antennas outside your bedroom window or on your neighbor's roof. Thank you for listening to my investigation into the Altenheim cell antennas. I wish to thank Councilmember Gallo and his staff for all their efforts and outreach, as well as residents of the Altenheim. Here are some email addresses and a website for more detailed information about these large type of emitting devices. And I'd like to thank everybody again. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexis. That was a lot of information, and I know there may be some questions, and just wanted to preface the question period by saying if there are specific things we are unable to provide you with an answer with this evening, that I will be following up and getting responses, and I can share that back through Alexis to all of you through your registration emails. If you did not provide an email and you would like something communicated back to you, you can also share your phone number in the chat directly with Alexis or myself. So just to give you that heads up. In order to participate in asking a question or sharing a comment, I'm asking that you use the raise hand feature, which